We should get people arriving more and more. We'll give them a couple of minutes to join in and get comfortable.
Definitely. I'm gonna lift my thing up. Right. Should we go to 5 minutes, Wayne? To 3:35?
Yeah, I think let's start at 3:35.
It's funny how we've all become so punctual now with online meetings. You know, you used to be able to sort of walk into a place about 5 minutes late, you know, with a coffee and have a bit of a chat, but now it's like 1 minute, they're 1 minute late, they're 1 minute late. We've become so much more punctual because now the meeting must start at the exact time.
I think we've got a couple more people arriving now, so let's give it another minute or two.
Just saying, if you don't feel like turning your camera on or your microphone on and saying hi just while people are coming in, feel free to introduce yourself and say hi in the chat, of course, as well. Thank you. Hi, Lara.
Hi, Lara.
Oh, you've lost your voice. Oh, no.
Yeah, I think my voice is only at about 75% after COVID, so I think we're all in the same boat there.
Just trying to find my camera to turn it on, but I can't. It's not turning on. So I'm sorry. I'm Sandra.
Hi, Sandra.
Hi, Sandra.
Sorry, I just can't. It's not coming up. So I give up.
Okay. I think, Heather, we might as well start. I think some people will be joining us late. So if you'll give me just a couple of minutes to do a quick little intro, and then I will hand over to you. Can I just check that everyone can hear and your sound is okay?
Yes.
I'm just busy multitasking and checking that all people are getting allowed in through the waiting room. One sec. Okay. Firstly, good afternoon and welcome to FameLab Academy. Now that we have the sound and the video working, I'd like to welcome you to the first of the teacher training workshops hosted by FameLab Academy and Dr. Heather Bray of the University of Western Australia. My name is Wayne. We would have spoken on phone or email a number of times. I'm the project manager for FameLab and FameLab Academy in Australia. And I'd like to start by acknowledging our partners and sponsors that have made FameLab Academy 2022 possible. Firstly, our partner Cheltenham Festivals, who created FameLab Academy. And I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our generous sponsors who have made this exciting program possible this year. The Fogarty Foundation, the McCusker Charitable Foundation, the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation, and the WA Museum. It's due to their generosity and sharing our objectives of increasing engagement with STEM subjects in students across WA and encouraging our future scientists that the Foundation for the WA Museum is able to produce and manage FameLab Academy. So we thank them deeply. These teacher training workshops are a new pilot program that we're starting this year to add even more value to participating schools and their teachers. Increasing participation and engagement in science will positively benefit future researchers, universities, schools, governments, the healthcare industry, innovators, and businesses. And it's with that in mind, I'd really like to express my gratitude to Dr. Heather Bray, coordinator of the Master of Science Communication at UWA, for her unbelievable enthusiasm, her time, her efforts, her expertise that she has so generously donated to formulate these teacher training workshops and for sharing her knowledge with us today. It's fantastic to have people of the caliber of Heather and the stature of a university like UWA partnering with us to make FameLab Academy an even richer experience for participating schools and their teachers. To all the teachers in attendance today, thank you for your time and for joining us. For the teachers who aren't able to make it live due to other commitments or will join late, a recording of the workshop will be shared so that they can also enjoy the benefits. With that, and my little part done, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Heather Bray, who will commence with the welcome to country and give us a glimpse into how she became a science communication lecturer at UWA. Dr. Heather Bray, over to you.
Thank you, Wayne. I'm just going to share my screen now. And I need to remember to click the share sound button. And I should really start my slideshow from the beginning. I'm just also going to make sure I can see the chat window. So hopefully everyone can see my slide there. And you can see that I've also provided my email details and also my Twitter handle if Twitter is something that is of interest to you. As Wayne mentioned, I like to acknowledge the country on which I'm standing. I'm currently on Wujak Noongar land here at Crawley at the University of Western Australia's campus. And I'd like to acknowledge that the Wujak Noongar people are the traditional custodians of the land. They are Australia's first science communicators. We are lucky to be on country that has this extensive tradition of sharing knowledge about how we came to be. And I acknowledge that science communication in Australia actually begins with our first Australians. And I'd like to acknowledge their custodianship, their ongoing contribution and relationship to the land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So the workshops that I've put together with Wayne have really two main goals. One is to provide you with and I've just got to move the screen out of the way so I can see my own slide, to provide teachers with the knowledge and tools to support your students' participation in FameLab Academy. This is the first time I've been involved, so obviously Wayne is your go-to person for all of the actual running of FameLab Academy, but I'm hoping to give you with some additional knowledge and tools to support your students' participation, but also to raise awareness of science communication as an important field of practice and inquiry within STEM. It's something that a lot of people don't tend to know about. It's not necessarily something that a lot of people think of when you think of STEM subjects in terms of areas that you can study at university, career paths, etc. And so I'm hoping to raise awareness of science communication more broadly by participating in these workshops. And it's to that end, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my career path, partly to tell you a little bit about myself, but also to show you how careers in science communication can take you in lots of different directions. So this is me back in 1987. I've just revealed my age, but there I am in the middle. My reason for starting with this slide is hopefully you've looked at the videos on Science Capital, and I'm going to be talking a bit about Science Capital today. I would certainly have considered myself as a student with very high science capital. I was interested in science. I saw myself as somebody who was sciencey, and that idea of science identity was very much a part of who I was. And when in my last year of high school, I was chosen to attend the National Youth Science Forum. This still runs, and I would certainly encourage those of you who have Year 11 science students to encourage your students to apply. And obviously my science capital increased dramatically by my participation in this particular school. I then went on to study agricultural science and did a PhD in animal production science. And it was through this that I started doing outreach and science communication as a PhD student. And so one of the things that I did, because I had that background in agriculture, was actually work at the Royal Show, both Sydney and Melbourne. So there's young me. I'm the one with the microphone. I'm here all week. That's my gags. So it was this opportunity to talk to people about the role of science in agriculture that really lit me up in terms of science communication. But I really heard about it for the first time at the Youth Science Forum. I then went and did a postdoc, did research in the Netherlands, looking again at pig diseases, because the agriculture is quite big there. And that was a fantastic opportunity to travel. A lot of people don't think of becoming a scientist to travel the world, but it's definitely one of the doors that's open to you. Now, I ended up leaving scientific research for a range of reasons I'm not going to go into now, but it was when I left science that I decided that I was really interested in making a career in science communication. So I started off as a volunteer at the Investigator Science and Technology Centre. It's Adelaide's version of SciTech. Unfortunately, it no longer runs, but I was starting there as a volunteer and then worked my way up through into delivering shows, working in outreach, hosting school groups. Then I ended up in exhibition development as well. So it was a fantastic opportunity to really find out about what a career as a science communicator was like. I also did a graduate diploma in science communication at the same time. And then I got a job as education officer for an agricultural research centre. So it was my job again to develop education programs for schools in the community about the technology that our institution was developing. Now, I don't expect everyone to be happy about genetically modified foods. We can have a conversation about that at the end. But it was my job to help people understand what genetically modified foods are so that they could make decisions about them. That's actually my son who's next to me, and he's graduating from university in next month. not science, by the way. Then I ended up changing jobs and becoming, again, the science communication officer in another research organisation. Through this, I did courses in radio production and video production. Social media was really coming online, so I was developing tools and processes for doing that on behalf of research organisations. And then I ended up coming back into research because I was fascinated by this relationship between science and society and trying to understand how we can engage communities more effectively in discussions about science. So this particular shot is me giving a presentation to a bunch of farmers, no PowerPoint. There's a beer tent over the back there, but in this amazing location, and trying to actually keep their attention for an hour was a challenge, I can tell you. I still do public engagement talks. This is a Science in the Pub event a few years ago where we're talking about biotechnology, gene editing in particular, trying to engage various communities in different ways around the science that I'm still very interested in. But now, or since 2019, I have been a lecturer here at the University of Western Australia. I'm running the Science Communication Masters, the undergraduate minor, the major, and teaching to all of the SCOM units here at UWA. So I hope that that's given you a bit of a snapshot of the kind of things that a science communicator does. Most science communicators are not also academics doing research about their own practice, but usually have jobs working for research centres. So in this workshop, I want to talk a little bit more about what science communication is in terms of its field of inquiry and practice. I also want to look at this concept called science capital, because when I found out about it, it really helped me think very differently about how we might engage students in STEM and how we might understand their participation and non-participation. And then I want to talk about some presentation skills today. So the idea today is a little bit of theory, a little bit of educational theory, or things that I think will help you as teachers, and then also some very specific things that are tailored to the participation in FameLab Academy. And that's the kind of thing that I will also do in workshop 2, a little bit of theory and some skills that you can pass on to your students straight away, and also hopefully something that encourages you in your own practice as teachers. So I think it would be good to just reflect for a moment on what science communication is. And I'm going to stop sharing shortly. Let me just look at what's on my next screen. Yes, I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion with the participants, get some feedback from you all about what you know about science communication, what you think it is, why is it important? I haven't actually said, is it important? I'm assuming that we all think it is. But also, who is a science communicator? Who might we call a science communicator? And are there people that are science communicators who are not scientists, etc.? So I'll just stop sharing briefly, because I'd love to hear from you all about what your impressions or understandings of science communication might be. Does anyone want to volunteer to offer up an answer to one of those discussion questions? What is science communication? What is it? Why is it important? And who might science communicators be? Anybody?
I think from me, Heather, the immediate examples that leap to mind is we've just been through the pandemic, and to identify a disease and then get an entire population to put a piece of cloth over their face when they are in a building or when they're traveling, and educate them and get them to go and get a jab or two. And every step along that way, from the scientists to the policymakers to the chief health officers to the political premiers, to everyone, that is just such a real world now current example. The other one I think is a real example is obviously the climate. And I think once you start hitting the amount of misinformation and disinformation that is circling around a number of topics, it is just so pivotal to educate people on what type of information they're getting, how to judge that information, how to judge their sources of information. And those are just sort of 2 examples. There's plenty more. Just having a look at the answers, David Attenborough would be a fantastic example. I completely agree with that. I think he has humanized those parts of nature and science that we don't get to see, and has really brought it in. And in fact, in many cases, we're using Sir David Attenborough as an example for FameLab of we're trying to find the next Sir David Attenborough. But it's that facet in so many different areas. Wildlife is a wonderful one, and traveling the world has all the glory around it. We also have water management, and we have mining and resources, and we have so many things that we need to communicate to people and pass down that line and make sure it's not Chinese whispers, but actually some kind of truth is getting through. So I think those are the ones that sort of leap to mind for me.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you. Also, so Lara, yes, definitely someone who's able to communicate with a wider, broader audience. And yeah, I agree. So David Attenborough is absolutely a fantastic example of a science communicator, and a really good example of someone who doesn't have a science degree who has become a science communicator. His background is not in science necessarily. And so I think, yeah, there's not too many upsides of the pandemic, but one of them has been it's made it a lot easier to talk about my job in terms of what science communication is. It's really been a bit of a science communication moment. And in New Zealand, one of the communicators who was really pivotal around that flattening the curve message early on and the masking up, she ended up becoming a New Zealander of the Year. And we had Jacinda Ardern saying, thank you, all science communicators. And we're like, oh, people have heard of us. Yay, this is so exciting. So definitely, I think making sure people can access that information. So someone who is a translator, an interpreter of scientific knowledge on behalf of the community. But I think one of the big things for me is also making sure that we have people who are translating what the community is saying back to the scientists. And that's a role that's not often clear. But I do think that that's a role that is also important, so that we're actually in a conversation with the community and not just telling them stuff. So one of my jobs as a science communication academic is making sure that scientists are also listening, and making sure that they understand that listening is part of communication as well. Were there any other thoughts or questions around science communication, why it's important, the kinds of people that are science communicators?
I think good science communication is important because I think we're in the age we're in with a social media and influencers with that miscommunication. And, probably as a scientist, you've got listening to the community, but it's also maybe listening to them and going, well, let's not believe everything we see, even though there are some people like David Attenborough who don't have a science degree, but they have been, have the experience in that area for so many years and devoted their life to it. But we, in this day and age, we've got the problem with everyone is trying to be a science communicator, but they don't really know so much about something. That's the only other downside of that. Yeah,
and I think this is where, I pointed out that I went to high school. I finished high school in 1987, but I don't think of myself as that old. And in my career, I grew up with 2 television channels and a World Book Encyclopedia in the library and a radio station. And now every opinion ever expressed, not only everything we know, but every opinion expressed is right here. And so the job of a communicator now is very different, where before it was this, the idea that we had the knowledge and we would give the knowledge away and that people would recognize us as experts. That's become very, very different for the next generation. And I see them coming through first year, second year, and they can't tell the difference between a blog and a news site. And they, their ability to judge credibility. And so we're having to teach them different skills around establishing credibility. And I think that's, again, where science communication is still really important, because we can talk about how we know what we know, not just what we know. And I think it's the how we know what we know that's becoming really important around scientific method, evidence, rigor, etc. So it's not just the content of science, but the process of science, that nature of science, aspect of science that's becoming more important when we communicate. Cool, thank you. So for the next part, I just wanted to run through a little bit of sort of science communication theory, give you a little bit of the idea of some of the ways that I introduce science communication as a field to my students. And that might raise some more discussion questions for us as well. So I'll just start sharing again. And remember, all share sound is tipped. That's lovely. So one of the things that's important to emphasise is we've always communicated science. You might have noticed when I acknowledged country that I tried to emphasise that Indigenous Australians have always been communicating science, and that Australia has one of the longest traditions of science communication, obviously, in the world. Because I'm also going to be showing later how what we think of as science communication is a very modern idea. But I think it's important to make it really clear that there's a range of ways of knowing about the world and a range of ways of talking about that. I love this other image here because it's actually a woman teaching geometry, obviously in the Middle Ages, and there's not too many images of women in science communication, unfortunately. But clearly, as well as being speaking about science, we've been writing about science for a very long time. And very early ways of communicating science involved scientists publishing books. And these were considered early ideas around science communication. Then we invented the journal and the idea of a scientific paper. This is 1667. That whole piece of text there is not even one sentence, that's half of a sentence. So thank goodness we don't write like this anymore. But basically the idea between scientific journals was that, hey, it's really important that we share knowledge about what we know with other people who are also trying to make knowledge, and wouldn't it be good if we had a mechanism for sharing it? So within scientific communities, the idea of sharing knowledge became a fundamental idea about an idea that became fundamentally important to the processes and progress of science. In the 1800s, we start to see a real emphasis on making sure the public can access scientific information as well. And so the Royal Institution that was founded, Michael Faraday, the famous physicist, he was in charge of the Royal Institution, and he started giving public lectures to enable people to learn about the wonders of science. And interestingly, at this time, it was a very Victorian idea that people should access knowledge, and that science and progress were very much linked not just to economies, but to ideas of social progress as well. And this is an idea that we still have very much in our societies today. But then we see in the 1960s, we see this sort of almost push against science in some ways. Everyone was like, yay, science. But then in the 60s, we can see that some areas of science are going to potentially cause us harm. And so we see the rise of the environmental movement. We see with the anti-war movement and things like anti-nuclear, we can see that some people are saying, yeah, not all science is great. We actually want to have a bit of a say about what science is done. But governments around the world started to see this anti-science push as potentially limiting their ability to make money and to drive economies through progress in science. And we still hear that language today. When you hear governments talk about the importance of STEM to our economies, they're talking about how science and technology enables economies to progress and societies to progress. And so they become a bit concerned when people don't seem to be supporting science. And it was really that move that in the 80s that led to several surveys about levels of scientific knowledge within adults. And the surveys were based on knowledge tests, and most adults could not pass these kind of knowledge tests. And so there became a lot of concern that the level of science literacy within the community was not high enough for people to be able to participate in these sort of democratic processes about whether we should have nuclear power, or, you know, much later on, things like genetically modified food, which I've been engaged in. So there was this real concern that science literacy was so low that we needed to do something about it. And so back in 1985, in both the UK and the US, but in particular in the UK, there was a report released that said everybody needs to have some understanding of science, because we need science for industry, public policies, affect people, etc. And it was really this that led to a whole range of recommendations around not just lifting and supporting science education in schools where you're all involved, but also making sure that there's communication directly to the public. And so you could see that things like looking at science in the media, improving science journalism, training for scientists, having scientific organisations involved in outreach, doing more outreach was very much a product of this kind of wave of concern about science literacy in the 80s. And so science communication as it is now, where it's taught at university and as part of the curriculum, is very much a response to that kind of concern. And you can see that that's exactly where we still are. We're still very much concerned about whether people actually have enough information to make good decisions when they vote, when they leave the house and put a mask on or not, when they sign up to a vaccination program. So in the 80s and 90s was where we see this big push in Australia. We see a national outreach program, the development of things like National Science Week. We see centres like SciTech started. We see formal training in science communication at universities. UWA is the second oldest program in Australia, and it's still one of only 2 places where you can do a Master of Science Communication. The other is at ANU in Canberra. So we're really proud of our program here at UWA and the fact that we've been involved in science communication for all that time. We have a professional association for science communicators, and since then we've got a science media centres and a whole range of investments in science communication. The science communicators may not have thought of themselves as science communicators at the time. We weren't necessarily using that term until this 80s time, but they were people who worked as education officers, people who worked in museums, people who worked as science journalists or science writers, communications officers within organisations. And of course, there's the scientists who communicate science, the scientists who still go back to the laboratory and do their work, but then come out and maybe appear on television or go to a pint of science or give a talk at a school. Those people are also still science communicators. Did it work, having all of this investment in science communication? Sort of. We still do have big issues that we need to grapple with in terms of public understanding of science and public engagement with science. There's still concern around vaccines. COVID's made that really apparent. We still have issues around climate change. This is kind of the reverse, where the community is concerned about inaction by the government on climate change because the scientific consensus is really true. We still have issues around how, whether there should be any role for biotechnology in food, and how do we produce safe food in a sustainable way. So these are still conversations that we're having and that we're dealing with. And it's not just going to be a case of these are the facts. We need to have science communicators that are able to discuss these in ways that help people understand these issues, navigate these issues, and find meaning. So we still have key issues in science communication that we care about. I mentioned science literacy, and I do think that science literacy is a very important concept, and I think is really important in education, but we tend to not focus on it in science communication for a range of reasons. And that's because there's a couple of issues to do with science literacy. One is, I would argue that to have functional societies, we also need to have people with knowledge of history and economics and other things. So we seem to only really emphasize science literacy above others, but I think we need a range of literacies within our communities. It's also not necessarily clear what the science is that people are meant to know in order to help them make decisions. As I mentioned, is that the scientific method? Should people know how science works? Should people know key scientific concepts, which of course may change as we learn more about the world? And which disciplines are more important? Should people understand chemistry or should people understand biology? So this is part of the challenge with these sort of knowledge tests, because they don't necessarily tell us whether people have the ability to find information, synthesize information, and critique information that they receive, which I would argue is actually more of the issue these days, because we can look anything up on Google. And I think the other problem with science literacy is that when we tend to assume that the public is ignorant, there's two things that happen. One is that we think it can just be corrected with facts. And I think 20 or 30, or what are we up to now, nearly 40 years of science communication practice shows that that isn't actually what happens. But the second is that we often then see ourselves as different to the public, and the public is other, and othering is never really a good thing. I don't always use science to make good decisions. Sometimes I eat the chocolate bar, sometimes I do things that I shouldn't. And I think having a much more realistic understanding of how people make decisions is going to make us more effective communicators. I know that this is a lot of text, and I would never advocate that normally as a presentation slide, but at the moment I'm in teaching mode as opposed to in public presentation mode. But I wanted to have both of these here, and I will make copies of the slides available, because really there are two schools of thought within science communication. And again, I'm talking about public understanding of science, not necessarily education in schools. But there's either this idea that we think of people as rational beings, that if we give them information, they'll process that and then they'll act differently. You know, once you learn something new, you should behave differently. And the core of that sort of idea is that if the more you know about science, the more you will love science. And if we just educated everyone, then they'd get the vaccine, they'd wear the mask, and they'd stop burning fossil fuels, and the world will be a great place. The second school of thought really within science communication is that we know that people don't make rational decisions. There will always be emotions involved. There's going to be cognitive biases. They're going to be guided by other things, and that somehow we just have to deal with that. I may have given away, I tend to be in the second camp after working in this career for 20 years or so. Unfortunately, just teaching people about the science is not enough. It is fundamentally important, absolutely, but we need to make sure that we communicate about other things as well. Unfortunately, the main thrust of science communication in the noughties, at least, it was really focused on education. And as I said, while education is important, it's not enough. This focus on education is known as the deficit model, and particularly the knowledge deficit model. And the idea that if we just give people the information, they will change their behaviour, dominated most sort of aspects of science communication. Even with COVID-19, we still saw a lot of people saying, oh, if we just tell people how mRNA vaccines are made, then they'll go and get one. When really we know that a lot of the opposition to vaccines was around mandates, it was around supposed freedoms and civil liberties, and a range of other things that wasn't actually to do with scientific knowledge. And so this is one of the core problems we have in science communication, is how we can communicate about science while knowing that knowledge in itself is not enough. In fact, sometimes if we give people knowledge, they actually tend to have more negative attitudes to the thing that we're talking about. So this is where, again, we have to really think very critically about the way we approach science communication problems. And I guess for me, one of the more important things around this deficit model idea is that framing the public as either ignorant or disinterested actually sets up these exclusionary ideas that there are people who almost, it's their fault that they're not engaging with the science. And I think it's really clear the science capital work that we're about to start talking about, and a lot of research more recently shows that there are people who are actively excluded from science, sometimes because of the way we talk about it, because we assume that the disengaged are choosing to be disengaged, when actually we know that science communication is not a level playing field. For example, a lot of the communication about COVID-19 was at a language level that many people didn't understand. We didn't provide it in languages other than English. Some of the languages other than English translations were incorrect. So we know that we have to do more to make sure that people can access scientific knowledge, and that we need to do more to overcome structural inequalities that are barriers to access. So for me, these are some of the big issues in science communication that I talk about in my teaching and that I'm actively involved in researching. So I just want to stop there for a moment. I was keeping an eye on the chat, but were there any questions or comments about those kinds of that potted history of science communication and that discussion of some of the issues that we're trying to grapple with around the relationship between scientists and society? Any comments or questions at this point?
I think one of the things I couldn't help thinking about, Heather, was, and I'm going to take this to the USA, so it's a little bit further away from our local politics, but how a political party can express very clean, clear, clever policies, and they still won't get the vote, even though it's rational information. And you still end up with another party who will just dismiss it as it's fake news, it's lies, they're actually the bad guys, they hate our country, and overcoming with facts. It's not just limited to science. It really is human behavior.
Absolutely. Life would be so much easier if people just did what the evidence said they should do. But we are complex, and this is where I think understanding, so obviously science communication draws on psychology and cognitive psychology, particularly when we're looking at issues like misinformation. So we draw on that. Obviously, we're drawing on educational theories as well. But then there's also these social and cultural things around identity and values and even philosophy, So science communication draws on all of these different areas to try to make sense of how people understand scientific concepts and then what they do with it at the end. So it's a challenging area to work in, and at times very frustrating. But I also think it's a fascinating area of STEM that probably deserves a bit of a higher platform, but I'm biased.
Absolutely. And I think one of the examples that you had in one of your slides was Galileo Galilei, that way back when, what is it, 15 or 1600s, discovered actually the sun was at the center of the universe, not the earth. And people didn't gather around and go, wow, that's brilliant, that's fantastic. But it directly opposed a bunch of views, and he was actually persecuted for his science communication and his discovery. So, this really goes back hundreds of years. It's and I know Professor Peter Doherty has done a bunch of talks on and written books on the knowledge wars. It's amplified a lot, but I think by current social media. People grab a headline and share it without interrogating it whatsoever. But it really goes to a deeper sort of human nature and human condition and human context that we need to take into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, our tendency is that when we're presented with new information that disagrees with our pre-existing thoughts, we want to reject it. And social media allows us to do that in a way that we've never been able to do before, in terms of selecting our information sources and rejecting others. When I was saying we had 2 TV channels at home, the only way we could find out about the world was through those. And if we choose not to watch them, then we had no information at all. But now we can see with the fraction, the way that there's been this fracture of media sources, people can tailor their news to exactly what they want and end up in those sort of filter bubbles and can have those worldviews reinforced so that any new information just cannot get through. so I do teach my students, my first years and my second years explicitly around logical fallacies, critical thinking and biases. In both the first and second year units, we really focus a lot on that. And this idea of real scientific thinking is being prepared to shift on the basis of evidence. And that ideas we held yesterday very strongly, we can give away as soon as the evidence isn't there and adopt a new position that's based on evidence. And that I think is a really difficult thing, because that's not the natural way that we think. We want to have a position and reinforce it, rather than be willing to let go of it on the basis of new evidence.
It's funny how that happens as well. As I'm fairly active on Twitter, and I'm very conscious of following different people with different views, and you still kind of fall into the trap of living in a bit of a echo chamber, and it's served to you by the algorithm of what you liked or what you commented on, and it's a very hard thing to see beyond, you know.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm running a little behind. I did want to begin, just have the brief conversation about Science Capital before taking a break. I think I will go ahead and do now, but I am going to have a 5-minute break after that, which I know is not strictly halfway through the session, but close enough. So those of you who are here, did you have a quick look at the Science Capital videos by any chance? Yes, no, yes, no. Yeah, bit of both, and that's fine. I do have the very, very short Science Capital video, which I think, again, I may skip, fair enough. But I think I'll just talk about it and encourage you to have a look at those later. So I'll share my screen again. Make sure I share sound. Oh, actually, I probably can run the other video share. So Science Capital is a concept that has emerged from King's College in London. They're education researchers, science communication researchers, who are interested in trying to understand why students who engaged in STEM subjects at school tended to be from the same group. Like, we tend to get the same kind of demographics who participate in science, and getting those students who are less likely to be engaged, who we would have called disengaged and we would have blamed them for not engaging, why are we not getting particular groups through? And so obviously girls is one of the groups that you know, this particular research group was interested. We know that participation in things like physics and chemistry for girls tends to be a lot lower. And engineering, why is that? What are some of the issues there? We know that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds don't tend to go into science as much, and a whole range of things. So I think for time, I will skip actually playing the video. But the idea is that it draws on this idea of capital, of Pierre Bourdieu's capital, the idea that as we move through life, we acquire resources, like in the same way we acquire economic capital, we require money that allows us to buy things. We also get social capital, and that might be kudos, or it might be know-how, the ability to move in social circles. If you've ever been in a situation where everyone else seems to know what they're doing and you don't, then you know that you haven't got that bit of social capital. And the idea of science capital is that there's students, as they move through school, are also building these sort of resources that enable them to move into STEM careers. And there are 8 domains that are affiliated with Science Capital. One is science literacy. I'm happy with science literacy here because we're talking really in a school context. But in addition to science literacy, the things that determine whether a student sees themselves as a potential scientist is things like science-related attitudes, values and dispositions, also knowledge about the transferability of science, so thinking that science is applicable in their lives and can be also applicable in a range of domains. science media consumption, whether people watch Sir David Attenborough or watch TV shows, participation in and out of school learning contexts. So if they're in a science club, family science skills, knowledge and qualifications. We know that children in families where there is a scientist are more likely to do science than in families where they aren't. So when I said I was definitely a high science capital person, I'm the first person in my family to do any kind of science. I was definitely the first person in my nuclear family to go to university. Both of my parents didn't go to university, but I had an uncle that did. And I'm definitely the first person in my family to do a PhD ever. So, you know, that in some ways, that's still really important. But luckily, I had all the other things and the idea of science being important. Knowing people in science-related roles, I wouldn't have known anyone who was a scientist before I did it, but also talking about science in everyday lives. So the idea is that these range of experiences, and you need sort of almost across all these kinds of dimensions, it's not just one of them, enable students to see that STEM may be for them. And the reason why I feel that this is such a really valuable concept when we're looking at engagement with STEM, not just in school students, but also more broadly. So I'm thinking about this in terms of what's the problem with why are we not engaging a range of people? Well, it may be because even adults don't actually have any of these dimensions and don't see themselves as people who engage in discussions about science in their everyday lives, or don't see themselves as liking science. So the main reason for raising it in this workshop context is I think that Science Capital will directly relate to the students who are likely to participate in FameLab Academy. And that really what FameLab Academy is trying to do is raise student science capital, because you can see that it's going to be partly that participation in out of school learning context. This is extracurricular. We know that it's going to help build their literacy. Hopefully it's going to expose them to all of these other great experiences in STEM, and that they're going to go, wow, that was really cool, I want to go on to it. But I also think that we need to make sure that it's not just the students who are always likely to participate in this that actually come along, and that we do try to support students who may have low science capital for no reason and through no fault of their own, and help them build that going through. So I did actually have a discussion, and I probably gave the answer to some of those away, but I guess I would really like to sort of think about or discuss with you whether this idea of science capital, even though I've just very briefly introduced it, this idea that there's a range of things that students need to have in their toolkit that enable them to be successful and to be engaged with STEM through their careers or through their learning journeys, whether that resonates with you and whether you can see that with the students that are coming through and the students that may have asked to participate, and how might we help build that in students with lower science capital through participation in FameLab Academy. So I'm just going to stop sharing again, and I'd really like to hear some thoughts about that.
Well, here we're running.
Sorry, Grace, go ahead.
That's right. We're running the FameLab with our 2 Year 8 classes. One's the gifted and talented, and the other one's the academic extension. And I think the reason is because they just love doing that sort of stuff. And most of them probably, it's for them going to be a gateway science into a university degree related to either engineering, mathematics, or science. Thinking about the students that I teach, and if I had to do this with maybe just a normal science class, I could see a couple of students who would be really engaged, but I could see a lot of students that wouldn't. And I think that would just be because they're more influenced by their social groups rather than, hey, you could do this, you'd be really good at it. And going off their own back going, actually, I'll do it. But then they'll be like, oh, well, my friends aren't doing it. So it is based on, if that student is not only engaged, but they want to be doing something that off their own back rather than, what their friends are doing. Yeah.
And I think that social group's really interesting too, because that is obviously where students go, well, people like me don't do that kind of thing. And I know that people like me don't do it because my friends are telling me, you know, and, you know, I'm the sporty person, or no, I'm this kind of person, I don't do that kind of stuff. And so for me, that's where Science Capital has a bit of power, where you can see students that are kind of almost opting out. They have the capacity, but they're opting out for other reasons. And to me, Science Capital helps me understand that. It doesn't necessarily tell me what to do. And I think it's completely fine if you are running it with your gift and talented group. As I said, we definitely want to make sure that we keep them. You know, they're the ones we want, because they are likely to be engaged in STEM throughout their lives. Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, I've just seeing what Lara's saying, another STEM gifted group, and you don't want to be building a bit, yeah, don't want to speak. And I think it's just, again, that there's also that the public presentation aspect of it that I think would be challenging for other students. Is that what you meant, Lara? Or yeah, that puts them off. I don't want to be a public speaking. I'm not that kind of thing as well. Yeah. I
think that's something also, Heather, that you and I have discussed, is it's not always scientists who are scientific communicators. Science communication has become a specialist field between those in the laboratory and those who need to hear what's going on in the laboratory. So within those two groups, there might be leave the ones who want to be building, keep building, and the others can look over their shoulder, see what they're doing, find out why they're doing it, and tell their story for them. There's a wonderful possibly match over there. I think also, Heather, one of the videos you shared, I thought was so fascinating about Science Capital, in that their research was a bunch of students understood the value of STEM. Mm-hmm. They believe that STEM is required for future solutions. All these positive, and then it gets to, could I be a scientist? And it drops down to absolutely nothing. And that gap of people being able to have access to go, maybe it is. What if? And I think that's where FameLab Academy can play an amazing role, just getting them to engage on a fairly fun way that isn't strictly, you know, academic science according to the curriculum, but it's sort of a side competition. It's just getting those social groups to hopefully drag each other along and join in.
Also, I think it's not like, you're right, you know, they go, I don't want to be scientists, but I think it's more, well, it's not just being a scientist, it's about having a skill that you can transition to another part of your life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what, in everything, it's hard to get the kids to, you know, that go, I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do this because I don't want to be a mathematician or scientist. But it's like, yeah, but you're not doing that. You're gaining a skill that you can transfer and pass on, but it's getting that in their heads as well. So when they're doing something like this, it's not just being science, it's actually communication. It's about being creative. It's about problem solving, but they still can't see that.
Yeah. They're very narrow around their perceptions of what things are, and they don't necessarily have that sense of that horizontal, those transferable skills. Absolutely. And I think, again, that's partly where sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about science as being science. And if we did talk about it as problem solving and being creative and being curious, you know, people are like, oh yeah, I'm that. Oh, you could be a scientist. Ooh, yeah. But unfortunately, we don't have any other kind of language to talk about this. I think, anyway, hopefully you can find the time to watch the longer video, because that is Louise Archer, who was developing this, sort of presenting her own work TED Talk style, and she has a bit more data in there. The other one is just the nice little cartoon. But to me, Science Capital has become something I see more and more, and we know that being a scientist, or even thinking about being a scientist, is identity work. And so we need students to be able to try this identity on in a safe environment where they feel secure and they feel that they can try out these new ideas. And I think that's what FameLab Academy will do. I did say that I wanted a 5-minute break, mainly so I can just turn my screen off for a minute because it is very intense, sort of looking at the Dalek eye on my camera, and just getting a drink of water. And you have all been sitting, so feel free to get up and stand. I would like to return in exactly 5 minutes. My clock says 4:30, and so definitely want to finish. I want to finish dead on 5 because that was a promise, but I would like to have just actually I'll make a 3-minute break. Is that all right? Just to make sure I don't go over time. 3 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Heather.
See you in 3 minutes. So, so Grace has just let me know that she has to leave fairly soon. Given that we are starting to run a little bit over time from where I had in my head we would be, I was planning on having an active discussion around what makes a good presentation before starting to talk a bit more about different presentation skills. I think I'll just forgo that discussion now and I'll jump into the presentation skills. But one of the things that I did want to flag up is, or that I wanted to briefly discuss, is this question around how do we teach presentation skills and be inclusive when we know that some of these ideas around what makes a good presentation are socially constructed. And that means that, you know, that they have our social values embedded in them. And the thing that I guess really clinched this for me was when I was preparing a lecture for the science presentation students. So this is a level 2 unit that I teach on science presentations. And I was going through some of the research and particularly watching videos around voice. And it was this idea that we know that lower voices have more authority. And my little feminist head went, hang on a sec, that's only because male voices are lower and that we're conditioned to think that they have more authority. And the more I started to think about it in terms of these ideas and these things that we teach students about what makes a good presenter, I did start to think, oh, these are all a little bit judgy and I don't feel really comfortable with them. And so I do think there's a bit of a challenge when we want students to be their authentic selves, and they might have an accent, they might have speech impediment, they might not be able to stand up straight, they might have blue hair or whatever, and how we enable them to be their authentic selves while we also know that they're going to be in a context where they will be judged around these sort of social norms. And so that's one of the challenges that I have as an educator in this space around how do I tell students to be themselves, because we want them to show their authentic selves to the world while also knowing they will be evaluated on how clearly they speak, how straight they stand, etc. But I also think one of the things I say to my students is that we also need to be a bit less judgy when we see presenters. And remind ourselves, you know, that we do live in this world with incredible social diversity. So these are the sorts of tensions that I do have when I talk about these things with students. So I'll share my screen again. That was our break time that I forgot to show. And moving on to the presenting aspects. And as I said, these are the sorts of issues that I grapple with. And this is where I do start talking about these things with my students, where we do have to remind them that we are constantly communicating, no matter whether we intend it or not. And we are communicating through our voice, through our gestures, and through our stance. And so that being aware that we're even in an interpersonal situation, that we are actually broadcasting continually is a way to sort of think about presenting. But that, yes, some of these things that we consider good presenting are actually grounded in sort of different ideas around what authority should be. A friend of mine who is Scottish was recently on radio, and she posted this on Facebook. She's a professor of history at the University of Adelaide, and somebody decided to tell her that her accent wasn't very good and didn't make her sound very intelligent, and that she should really tone it down, her thick Scottish accent. And you just kind of go, where do people get up? Anyway, one of the classic ones we often hear is girls in particular going up at the end of sentences. And I always try to encourage people to go down, but then I also am aware that that's very much a classist way of thinking about it, because that going up at the end of sentences is very typical of people within a particular social demographic, and that's how they speak to each other. So we need to be really careful, I think, where we encourage people to be different, but don't want to take that authenticity away from them. So, non-verbal communication elements, our voice, gestures, and body language. Voice, there's so many elements to voice that, and if you've ever done any radio, you'll be thinking about these. That register, that is that range of high notes to low notes. And that's again where we often hear that we should speak in a low register if we want people to think we're actually good at our job, which is fine if you have lots of testosterone and your voice is naturally in a low register. Again, I do think we often find when we're nervous, our voice goes up, and that can be part of where that idea about register comes in. And I think if we can encourage our young people when they speak to not be nervous, we will find that their voice will drop a little. But I also think it's mainly that around that perception of nervousness. But if somebody has a naturally high voice, we don't want them to try and lower their voice because that's not going to be authentic. And absolutely breath work helps with that. That's one of the strategies that I use when dealing with nerves. The timbre, the texture of voice. If you're ever doing radio first thing in the morning, make sure you do actually warm your voice up. And we should encourage our speakers to warm their voice up as well, because we want to try and make sure that people have that kind of rich texture to their voice. The prosody is that up and down tone. I have a very typical Australian East Coast accent, which comes through my nose, and I can be incredibly monotone and not really vary the pitch of my voice at all without too much trouble. But that's really boring. So I need to remember to go up and down and move the sound of my voice around. And that helps with emphasis, and it makes it more interesting to listen to. So when my radio voice definitely goes up a lot more and goes down more often than my normal speaking voice. So trying to encourage a little bit of that variation in prosody. There's pace. Most of the time we're encouraging students to slow down. But again, when we're nervous, our pace will increase. The pace fast pace can be really useful if you're trying to demonstrate some excitement and enthusiasm, and definitely slowing down helps with gravitas. It helps slow the mood down. And we know that pauses can be really effective as well. So encouraging our students to think about the pace. I've already mentioned the pitch. The register is the range, but the pitch is again how high or how low it is. Volume, making sure that our students feel confident enough to have enough volume in their voice to speak. And clarity, of course, is vital. So there's a whole range of voice attributes that we're trying to help our students acquire, and so that they feel very comfortable. Thank you, Grace. Hopefully, by working through nerves, we can help them to have really interesting voices. Gestures, I gesture a lot and I have to tone it down, but they can be descriptive when we're talking about small things or we're talking about big things. They can add emphasis. They can be suggestive. So who puts up their hands when they gesture, when they practice? And they can also be prompting. So I'd love to hear what you would like to hear. So there can be all of these different kinds of gestures so that you don't end up in a situation like me, where sometimes I look like Kermit the Frog on acid, or that I don't know what to do with my hands. I really encourage students to plan them and practice so that we do end up with those range of gestures and that they are used in, they become comfortable and they then don't become too much. So again, we tell people to minimize distracting gestures. Some people will scratch their head and things like that when they're nervous. Again, people may have tics and things like that, and it's important that they feel enabled to actually participate in programs like this as well. And so that when we talk about these things, we're encouraging students to do it, but we're not necessarily saying, well, you know, you can't participate because you can't gesture in a particular way. So I think, again, it's that balance between being inclusive and also knowing that this is a genre of presentation where there are norms of behaviour that are kind of expected. Oops. Body language. This is another one when in the research, the woman was wearing a skirt and the man was wearing trousers. And again, I'm like, anyway, I think we often do see things like this open stance, the minimising movement. I do tend to walk around on stage, and I've just heard myself do arms as well. Yes, I do that sometimes. Try to speak with a relaxed, happy face. Even when I'm on radio or doing a podcast, I try to smile. Unfortunately, sometimes when I try to smile as well as being serious, I end up smiling on half my face, and that looks weird. So I do try to relax my face, and definitely appropriate clothing. Now, again, this is where we want our students to feel like they can be themselves. They may be participating in this in a uniform anyway, but generally, I would dress in appropriate clothing for the audience. I do find that if I'm going to do a Science in the Pub event, or I would dress differently to when I was going to talk to those farmers, to when I might be presenting in front of potential investors. Again, with appropriate clothing, it might be useful to if you're ever presenting anywhere, find out what the audio-visual setup is. Because if you've got a lapel mic, you need to have the correct clothing to attach that to, because that's another gendered piece of equipment, and have a pocket, etc. Teachers may be aware of that if you're wearing FMs for students and things like that, but often knowing what the audio-visual setup is before you go and present somewhere is really important. I think with these students doing video, it may be less of a consideration, but when they come to do live events, making sure that the students know what kind of audio-visual equipment they're going to be using is really important. And I think with managing nerves, to me, the secret has been to understand why. So given that I'm a science person, I like understanding the scientific information about why we get nervous. It helps reassure me that it's not something about me and it's not something that's unique to me. And of course, the reason why we get nervous is that our brain recognizes this bunch of happy, smiley people baring their teeth as a bunch of wolves bearing their teeth out at us. We can't, the lizard part of our brain can't necessarily distinguish. It's very weird to be standing there in a crowd and having lots of people look at us. We interpret that as a threatening gesture. And then, of course, what happens is adrenaline floods our system, and this gives us increased heart rate, an increased respiratory rate, vasoconstriction for some areas and dilation in others. It stimulates glycogenolysis. I can still say that word, which means that we end up with sort of a bunch of sugar rush through our system. We get all sorts of other things going, and muscle contraction often where you don't want it. For me, I get it in the knees. My knees start to jiggle when that bolus of adrenaline hits me. my voice goes up, I constrict in the throat, and my knees start to shake, and I really hope no one can tell. For me, again, I am reassured by the science, because adrenaline has a half-life of about 2 minutes. So provided I can convince my brain that I'm actually not in any danger and not get more adrenaline released, then I should only be feeling the effects of it for about 2 minutes. So quite often I will start speaking, I'll be aware that it hits, I'll feel it in my voice, and I could always just go, just one moment, or take a sip of water at that point. I try to remind myself that the audience is friendly and that I'm okay, and it's just adrenaline. It's not me, it's just adrenaline, and it's going to go in a minute. Just ride it out. And knowing that I've got 2 minutes and then I'll be okay has always helped me, even when I'm in those big auditorium type of presentations where you can't help it, your lizard brain goes. Just knowing that I only have to write it out for a couple of minutes and then I'll be fine really helps me with my nerves. The other things that I would suggest to students is preparation and practice. Nothing works better than actually feeling like you know what you're going to do, and that you know what you're going to say. Definitely that breathing, that breath work helps, the yoga style breath work. So not deep breaths in, but breaths out and relaxed refilling, because you don't want to hyperventilate. Having a drink of water. Affirmations and visualizations are really important. Focusing on the audience, if that helps. Some people don't like doing that. Smiling on the inside, knowing that you're actually there to have a good time, and pausing. It's always okay to take a breath. And I can see sometimes when students are presenting, you can see when the adrenaline hits them, and just sort of say, it's okay, take a moment, regroup. It's only going to last a couple of minutes. Just take a second or two to regroup and continue. I think is really important, so that they don't end up in that reinforcing the panic and triggering more and more adrenaline release. Just with the affirmations and visualizations, there was some research going around earlier a few years ago, and that's Brené Brown, I think her name is. Anyway, she's now a famous sort of TED talker. She was talking about this idea of power poses, and the idea that we can make ourselves feel confident by adopting really positive body language. The research on that work has never been repeated. So I'm not saying that it's flawed research, but there is a bit of a question mark around it. So I don't necessarily advocate this to people anymore. However, if it works for you, do it. I definitely do it. I walk around, particularly before a radio interview or whatever, walking around with my hands on my hips, and I tell myself the amazing affirmation of, you do this for a living, you'll be okay, you've been okay before, you'll probably be okay again. So I don't necessarily big myself up or anything, but just reminding myself that I've done this before, it was okay, and I'll probably be okay again. And that's one of the sorts of ways that I deal with nerves. To deal with nerves during a presentation, just take a pause. As I said, have a drink. The audience is usually sympathetic. The pause will always feel longer to you than it ever does to the audience. And also then after your presentation, have a little treat, reflect, but only don't allow yourself to churn about negative things. Try to pick maybe one thing that you may want to improve on. But be kind to yourself. And we're going to talk a bit more about this next week around helping students improve their practice through watching themselves or reflecting with kindness and detachment. So I did want to end on a very brief discussion about whether being a good public speaker is the same as being a good science communicator, or is there other things? So I'll stop sharing now. I know we've only got about 8 minutes to the end of the session, but I just wanted to quickly get your ideas. Is being a good public speaker essential to being a good science communicator? Is it the same thing? What do you think?
I think something, Heather, that I've just realized, having been through your lessons, is I can't help but hear myself talking to my kids when they used to say, but I'm not good at maths. And you go, well, you got to learn maths. And it's the same thing I think I've had, where you look at people and you go, but they're so good at public speaking. And when you go through the skills that you've just been through and coming to terms with nerves and understanding your content, and I know you're going to be talking more about the strategy of ensuring you are across your content and who your audience is and how to get that message across next week. But public speaking is a skill, and you can learn it and you can practice it and you can improve. So I can't help but sort of wag my finger at myself for all those years. I said to my kids, you don't have to be good at maths, you need to learn maths. I think public speaking is a fantastic asset for science communication. But for example, in my previous lifetime, I was a writer, and the public speaking part did not come naturally, whereas the written format was very easy for me. So, and I think it's not necessarily, or it's definitely not the same thing, having both skills, being able to present on video nowadays with, you know, all the different platforms, being able to write a pithy tweet, wonderful skills. But certainly public speaking isn't the only format for science communication, but it does refine skills that you need to take a lot of information, distill it, for example, in the FameLab and FameLab Academy format, a lot of research and information, and distill it down to 3 entertaining, captivating minutes, is a skill beyond just public speaking. It's information management, I think. So
yeah, and I think I absolutely agree with you. And thank you, Lara. Yes, I do think science communication and public speaking have different purposes. And that's a great segue into some of the things that we'll be talking about next week, in terms of the purpose of what we're saying. And so I do agree with you. I think part of what we're trying to do in science communication, or even with FameLab Academy, is yes, there's the presentations aspect, but it's the what are you presenting? How are you constructing that story that we'll go into? And in science communication, we may not just be trying to entertain, which arguably some public speaking is, but there's nothing wrong with just entertaining either. We may be trying to persuade, we may be trying to educate, we may be trying to raise awareness. Personally, for me, a lot of I've become a bit frustrated with the raising awareness thing, and I want to see persuasion. I want to see behaviour change. I want us to start doing things to save this amazing planet. I want us to have the conversation about how we produce food sustainably without damaging the planet. I want to have the conversations and see the behaviour change around making sure that everyone has equitable access to healthcare. These are the things that get me up in the morning. So being a good public speaker is one of those things, but it's the strategies that I use and the tactics and the messages that I'm conveying, they're more important. And oral presentation is a vital skill and a part of that. And you're so right about these digital production things coming online. They're part of the units that I teach now, but also the writing is a huge aspect as well.
I think just to Lara's point as well, again, I hate to pick on politicians. It sounds like I'm picking on them, but they're very comfortable with public speaking. But I love this term word salad, where they can speak for 3 or 4 minutes. They say many, many words, and you've got no idea what just entered your brain because it makes no sense whatsoever. So yes, there's a very big difference between science communication, having an objective, trying to change behavior, and being good at getting up on your hind legs and keeping your mouth moving.
Absolutely. So that's all of the content that I hope to cover today. As I said, it was mainly, I do have one more slide, I think, just to show that, just to make sure. So yes, so I made, just to go back to what I covered, looked at what is science communication, we covered that. Had a little bit of a chat about science capital as concept and how that can help us understand students' participation in STEM, and then started thinking about presentation skills and how we might actually teach those, particularly non-verbal communication and managing nerves. So I'm going to make available 2 recorded lectures that I have, one on each of managing nerves and the non-verbal communication. I'll be making those available to you in the workshop. I think you also mentioned, Wayne, that they may also be made available to students as well. Was that the case? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're lectures that I have, and I put myself green screen, so I'm modeling the things while I'm talking about it, but it's essentially the content that I just went over there. And then there's also the Science Capital video to leave with you. Next week, again, we'll talk a little bit around some sort of more sort of theoretical things, but also the really important take-home things to help your students with FameLab Academy in terms of writing and structuring the presentation. So how do you actually tell an engaging story? Were there any other questions or comments or things that you wanted to add, Wayne, before we finish up?
No, I don't think I've got anything to add other than to say, Heather, thank you so much. I absolutely love listening to you. I always learn so much, and I really do appreciate all the passion and energy and expertise that you're sharing, and the fact that you're donating your time. On behalf of FameLab Academy, I'd really like to thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. If there's any other questions from Sandra or Lara, thank you. Please feel free to either pop them in the chat or save them up for next week. Other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and I hope to see you all next week.
We will see you all, and to the teachers who attended, thank you very much, and hopefully we see you next week again.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Sandra. Bye.